A lone soldier knelt in the snow, staring at a tiny circular object in his hand. A shattered pocket mirror no bigger than a matchbox, its fractured surface catching the pale winter sunlight and throwing a brief, brilliant flash across the frozen forest. And then the light vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the gray expanse of birch trees and snow that stretched endlessly across the Russian landscape near Smolensk in the winter of 1943. That single flash of light, seen from 300 meters away by German soldiers who were trained to spot exactly such reflections, triggered one of the most perfectly executed ambushes of the Eastern Front, an engagement that would save an entire Soviet battalion from annihilation and demonstrate that sometimes the most effective weapons in war aren't guns or bombs but the creative application of physics and psychology, though the story of how a broken mirror became an instrument of tactical genius begins hours earlier on a morning when death seemed inevitable and survival appeared impossible for the Soviet forces trapped in the frozen forests southwest of Smolensk. The forest of ghosts stretched before Alexei Voronov like a landscape from a nightmare. Endless rows of white birch trees standing like skeletal sentinels in the snow, their bark peeling in pale strips that looked like exposed bone, their branches heavy with ice that occasionally cracked and fell with sounds like distant rifle shots, creating a constant auditory confusion that made distinguishing real threats from natural phenomena nearly impossible. The environment was cold beyond anything Alexei had experienced in his 22 years. A cold that penetrated every layer of clothing and settled into bones and joints, that made metal weapons painful to touch and turned breath into clouds of frozen vapor that hung in the air and potentially revealed positions to enemy observers, that killed as efficiently as bullets by inducing hypothermia and frostbite in soldiers who couldn't keep moving, couldn't generate enough body heat to survive the Russian winter that had defeated Napoleon and was now grinding down another European invader. Fog layered between the trees in horizontal bands, creating zones of visibility and concealment that shifted with temperature changes and wind patterns, making reconnaissance difficult and ambushes easy. And through this fog German patrols probed relentlessly, firing flares that arced overhead and bathed the forest in harsh magnesium light that created stark shadows and blinded anyone looking toward the source, expecting a Soviet retreat because their intelligence suggested the Russian forces were cut off and running low on ammunition and morale. Alexei Voronov was a reconnaissance scout, one of those soldiers who moved ahead of the main force to gather intelligence, to observe enemy positions, to map terrain and identify threats, and he possessed qualities that made him exceptional at this dangerous work. He was observant in ways that went beyond normal military awareness, noticing small details that others missed, the way snow had been disturbed, the direction wind carried sound, the patterns in enemy patrol schedules, and he was quiet. Not just in movement but in temperament, rarely speaking unless necessary, preferring to watch and think and analyze before acting, and he was quick thinking in the way that keeps soldiers alive when situations change suddenly and old plans become obsolete and survival depends on immediate adaptation. Most importantly, Alexei was unusually calm under fire, didn't panic when bullets cracked past his head or shells exploded nearby, maintained the kind of focused awareness that let him make rational decisions when other men were operating on pure adrenaline and fear, and this combination of qualities had kept him alive through 18 months of combat on the Eastern Front where the average life expectancy of a reconnaissance scout was measured in weeks not months. He crouched in a frozen foxhole on the morning of January 23, 1943, watching German positions through a gap in the snow-covered undergrowth, noting their patterns of movement, identifying their machine gun nests by the distinctive sound of MG-34s, counting soldiers and estimating unit strength, and all the while a small object rested in his coat pocket, a broken mirror shard he'd found weeks earlier in an abandoned farmhouse, kept because mirrors were useful for looking around corners without exposing yourself, for signaling in sunlight, for checking if you were bleeding from wounds you couldn't see. Though Alexei didn't yet know that this tiny piece of broken glass would soon become the most important piece of equipment he'd ever carried. The tactical situation was desperate in ways that even the most optimistic Soviet officer couldn't deny. Alexei's battalion, originally 500 men, now reduced to perhaps 300 after weeks of fighting and attrition, was exhausted, dug into freezing foxholes that provided minimal protection, cut off from the main Soviet line by a German Kampfgruppe that had infiltrated during the night and now threatened to encircle them completely, and pinned in place by superior German numbers and firepower, particularly the machine gun nests that commanded every obvious approach and made movement suicidal. The battalion couldn't withdraw because retreating would expose the entire Soviet regiment behind them to a German breakthrough that could collapse the entire sector. Couldn't stay in place because the Germans were bringing up reinforcements and artillery that would eventually pound their positions into submission, and couldn't attack frontally because that would be suicide against prepared defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. The battalion commander, Major Dmitry Sokolov, a 40-year-old former schoolteacher who'd been thrust into command after his predecessors were killed, held a desperate conference with his officers in a dugout that smelled of damp earth and unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of blood from wounded men being treated nearby, and the debate centered on impossible choices. Attempt a risky breakout that would cost heavy casualties, hold position and hope for relief that probably wasn't coming, or surrender, which wasn't really an option because Soviet soldiers knew what happened to prisoners on the Eastern Front. Ammunition was running critically low. Some riflemen had fewer than 10 rounds left. Machine gunners were rationing bursts to conserve belts. Mortars had maybe 20 shells between them. And morale was collapsing as soldiers who'd survived months of combat began to accept that this frozen forest would be where they died. Alexei attended this conference because scouts were valued for their knowledge of terrain and enemy positions, and as he listened to officers debate tactics, he studied the map spread across a crude wooden table, his mind working through the geometry of the situation, analyzing angles and distances and lines of sight, and a pattern emerged that others hadn't seen because they were thinking about force disposition and firepower ratios while Alexei was thinking about psychology and perception. The major weakness in the German position, the vulnerability that could be exploited, wasn't tactical but psychological. The Germans moved aggressively only when they believed they'd spotted a fleeing Soviet soldier or an exposed scout, became cautious and defensive when they couldn't see targets, which meant they were reactive rather than proactive, responding to visual stimuli rather than executing predetermined plans, and this reactivity could potentially be weaponized if someone could create convincing false stimuli that would trigger German aggression in a direction that served Soviet interests rather than German ones. Alexei's hand moved unconsciously to his coat pocket, fingers touching the broken mirror shard, and in that moment of tactile contact an idea began forming. An idea so simple it seemed absurd and so potentially effective it might be brilliant, an idea that required nothing more than sunlight and broken glass and the knowledge that German soldiers were trained to spot reflections because reflections meant metal, which meant equipment, which meant targets. "Comrade Major," Alexei said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper because he'd learned that quiet words often commanded more attention than loud ones. "I have an idea that might work, but it requires the Germans to commit large numbers to pursuit, to believe they're chasing an exposed scout who's trying to escape, and I think I can make them believe that without actually exposing anyone." The officers stared at him because Alexei rarely spoke during planning sessions, usually just absorbed information and executed orders, and Major Sokolov nodded for him to continue, and Alexei explained his observation about German reactivity, about how their training emphasized visual acquisition of targets, about how reconnaissance snipers and spotters often gave away positions through scope glint or equipment reflection, and then he pulled the mirror shard from his pocket and held it up so it caught the dim light filtering through the dugout entrance, creating a small bright spot on the earthen wall that danced as his hand moved slightly. "Light," Alexei said simply, "moves faster than soldiers, covers more ground than sound, and the Germans are trained to chase it, to interpret reflections as movement, as equipment, as targets, and if I can create a pattern of flashes that suggests a scout moving through the forest, fleeing toward a specific location, I believe I can make them commit forces to pursuit, make them leave their defensive positions and enter terrain where we choose the engagement rather than them choosing it." The idea sounded insane when spoken aloud, seemed like something from a fairy tale rather than military tactics, but Major Sokolov had fought long enough to know that conventional tactics weren't working, that desperate situations sometimes required desperate solutions, and that the Eastern Front had proven repeatedly that improvisation and deception could achieve results that firepower couldn't. So after a long pause he said, "Show me the terrain where this could work, show me the kill zone you're imagining, and explain how you'll control the timing, because if this fails we've wasted our last opportunity." Alexei led the officers to a ridge overlooking a narrow pass that led to a frozen creek, terrain he'd scouted 3 days earlier during a reconnaissance patrol when he'd noted that the pass created a natural funnel with steep ridges on both sides that were perfect for crossfire, that the creek bed was frozen solid enough to support men but surrounded by soft snow that would slow movement and prevent rapid escape, and that the acoustics of the valley meant that sounds, including gunfire and explosions, would bounce and echo in ways that made determining the source difficult and created an impression of forces larger than actually present. Here, Alexei said, pointing to spots on both ridges where Soviet machine guns could be positioned to create enfilade fire that would sweep the length of the pass. And here, indicating where mortar teams could deploy to cover the flanks and cut off retreat routes. And I will move through the forest from here, tracing a path with his finger, creating light signals that will appear to the Germans as a scout in retreat, flashing at intervals that suggest running movement, each flash slightly farther along the path toward the pass, and they will interpret this as a breakthrough opportunity, a chance to pursue and eliminate an isolated soldier, and their doctrine emphasizes aggressive pursuit of retreating elements because that's when disorganized enemies are most vulnerable. The plan required precise timing, required Alexei to move through enemy-contested terrain while remaining undetected, required the machine gun and mortar teams to hold fire discipline until the Germans were fully committed to the pass, and required the Germans to behave exactly as Alexei predicted they would. But the alternative was either suicide through frontal assault or slow death through attrition. So Major Sokolov made the decision that commanders sometimes must make, the decision to trust a young soldier's unconventional idea because conventional options had all failed. The preparation took hours of meticulous work that combined technical precision with artistic sensibility, because Alexei wasn't just setting up military equipment but creating a visual narrative that would be read and interpreted by German observers from 300 meters away through fog and forest. And every detail had to be correct or the illusion would fail and the ambush would become a massacre. Alexei tested mirror angles by holding the shard at different positions and watching how sunlight reflected, noting that direct reflection created a sharp bright flash that lasted less than a second as the angle changed, that this flash could be seen from surprising distances, that movement of the mirror created a scanning effect that suggested motion rather than a static reflection, and that multiple small flashes at different locations created an impression of something moving through space, rather than a single reflective surface. He broke more pieces of mirror, carefully using a rock to fracture the glass into fragments ranging from thumbnail size to matchbox size, each piece becoming a potential light source, and he collected other reflective materials. Bits of polished tin from ration cans, scraps of aluminum foil from equipment packaging, even small pieces of ice that he polished with his glove until they caught light, and he planned a path through the forest where these materials could be positioned to create a sequence of flashes that would tell a story of movement. The afternoon sun was critical because sunlight came from a low angle that penetrated the forest canopy in sharp beams that created dramatic contrasts of light and shadow, and Alexei calculated where these beams would fall, where a reflection would be visible from German positions, where the line of sight was clear enough for observers to see the flash but interrupted enough by vegetation that they wouldn't see what was actually creating it. The Soviet machine gunners. Grim men who'd been firing Maxim guns since the start of the war, who knew their weapons like extensions of their bodies, who could disassemble and reassemble them blindfolded, moved into position on the ridges overlooking the pass, their movements slow and careful to avoid creating snow disturbances that German observers might notice, carrying their weapons and ammunition in ways that distributed weight and prevented metallic sounds, and they established firing positions that provided maximum coverage of the kill zone while offering protection from return fire, piling snow and cut branches to create improvised parapets that would stop rifle rounds and provide concealment. The mortar teams, younger soldiers who'd been trained in the mathematics of indirect fire, who understood trajectories and timing, who could drop shells with surprising accuracy despite their weapons' inherent limitations, deployed to flanking positions where they could engage the rear of any force entering the pass, their observers identifying landmarks and measuring distances and calculating firing data that would let them hit targets they couldn't see by dead reckoning and forward observer corrections. Alexei moved among these teams, explaining what he was attempting, describing the signals they should watch for, emphasizing the critical importance of fire discipline because if anyone opened fire too early the Germans would scatter and the ambush would fail, if they waited too long the Germans might detect the trap and withdraw, and the timing had to be perfect, had to catch the German force at maximum commitment when they were too far into the pass to retreat quickly but not yet close enough to Soviet positions to pose immediate threat. Alexei took position 300 meters forward of the Soviet line, moving through the forest with the careful deliberation of someone who knew that a single mistake would mean death, crawling through snow that soaked his uniform and made his hands numb, freezing motionless when German voices drifted through the trees, his heart hammering but his breathing controlled, making himself think clearly despite the fear that whispered he was insane to be this far forward, this close to enemy positions. He carried his rifle, his remaining ammunition, 2 grenades that might buy him seconds if he was discovered, and most importantly the collection of mirror fragments and reflective materials that represented the entire foundation of his plan. And he began positioning these materials along the path he'd selected, placing some at ground level tied to vegetation, hanging others from low branches where they would catch wind and create natural movement, angling each piece so it would reflect sunlight toward German positions when he passed by and triggered it with his own mirror, creating a secondary reflection that would appear to be primary. The process was agonizingly slow because each placement had to be perfect, had to create the right visual effect, had to be invisible from German positions until the moment it flashed, and Alexei worked with the focused intensity of someone whose understanding that mistakes cost lives extended beyond abstract knowledge to visceral certainty. And by the time he'd positioned all the materials and moved to his starting point, the sun was lowering toward the horizon and the light was taking on that golden quality that precedes evening, perfect for creating dramatic reflections that would be visible through forest fog. The first flash was deliberate, calculated, almost ceremonial in its execution. Alexei raised the primary mirror shard, angled it carefully by watching where the reflected sunlight fell on nearby tree trunks, adjusted incrementally until the reflection pointed toward known German positions, and then, with a smooth rotation of his wrist, he swept the reflection across the forest in a sharp, bright line that lasted perhaps half a second before passing beyond the German field of view. And then he held absolutely still, waiting, listening, watching. From 300 meters away, the German soldiers on watch saw exactly what Alexei intended them to see. A brief, bright flash of reflected sunlight at approximately human height, moving left to right at a speed consistent with someone running, appearing for an instant between tree trunks and disappearing as the person presumably moved behind cover. Exactly the kind of visual signature that reconnaissance training emphasized as indicating enemy movement, as identifying targets that needed to be engaged or pursued. German helmets turned, conversation stopped, officers raised binoculars and scanned the area where the flash had originated, and Alexei could hear, faint but distinct, voices calling out in German, orders being given, soldiers shifting positions, machine guns being traversed toward the suspected location. And he knew with satisfaction that the first step had worked, that the Germans had noticed, had interpreted the flash as he'd intended. But now came the difficult part, the part that would determine whether they simply fired at shadows or committed forces to pursuit. Alexei waited exactly 30 seconds, counting in his head with the steady rhythm he'd learned from years of timing demolition fuses and artillery barrages, and then he moved quickly to the second position he'd prepared, crawled 15 meters to the left through snow that was disturbed enough by his earlier passage that fresh disturbance wouldn't be obvious, and he raised the mirror again and created another flash, this one slightly farther along the path toward the pass, and again the flash was brief and bright and suggestive of movement, and this time the German response was stronger, more organized, because two flashes in sequence suggested not just random reflection but deliberate movement, suggested a target moving with purpose toward a specific destination, and Alexei heard distinctly the sound of German soldiers beginning to move, heard the metallic clinks of equipment and the muffled voices of men receiving orders and the rustle of many bodies moving through vegetation. And through the fog he saw shapes beginning to advance, saw the Germans dispatching what looked like a full platoon, maybe 30 or 40 men, moving cautiously but definitely pursuing the apparent Soviet scout who seemed to be fleeing through the forest. The Germans thought they'd spotted a breakthrough point, thought they'd identified a route where Soviet defenses were weak or non-existent, thought they were pursuing a single isolated soldier who was trying to escape encirclement, and their doctrine emphasized exactly this kind of aggressive pursuit because disorganized retreating enemies were easiest to destroy, and so they committed forces, called up reinforcements, began moving with the overconfidence of soldiers who believed they'd identified an opportunity rather than walking into a trap. Alexei created the third flash, then the fourth, each one carefully timed and positioned to continue the narrative of movement, to suggest a scout running desperately through the forest, trying to maintain cover but occasionally visible through gaps. And the pattern was convincing because Alexei had studied human movement, had observed how people running through forests moved in bursts and pauses, how reflections from equipment appeared at irregular intervals rather than steady rhythms. And his flashes mimicked this natural pattern, made the illusion believable, made the Germans commit more forces because they were seeing not just light but a story, a target that could be caught and eliminated, an opportunity that was slipping away unless they moved quickly. The German force grew larger as more soldiers joined the pursuit, as officers made the calculation that this might be their chance to break through Soviet lines, as the combination of tactical opportunity and aggressive doctrine overcame the caution that should have made them question why a single scout would be running through this particular section of forest at this particular time. And Alexei watched through gaps in the vegetation as the German column stretched longer, as more and more soldiers funneled toward the pass, as the trap that he'd spent hours preparing began to close around an enemy that didn't realize they were being manipulated, that thought they were hunters when they were actually prey. Alexei crawled backward through freezing swamp water that soaked him to the chest, his body temperature dropping to dangerous levels, but his mind focused entirely on maintaining the illusion, on creating the intermittent flashes that kept the Germans committed, on leading them toward the kill zone with a trail of reflected sunlight that appeared to be a fleeing soldier but was actually nothing more than mirrors and physics and the exploitation of training that had taught German soldiers to trust their eyes, to believe that reflections meant targets, to pursue aggressively when they thought they'd spotted weakness. From the German point of view, the situation seemed clear. They were chasing someone through the forest, seeing metallic reflections that suggested equipment, following a path that appeared to lead toward Soviet rear areas, and their training said this was exactly the kind of opportunity that won battles, exactly the kind of aggressive pursuit that disrupted enemy plans, and so they advanced faster, moved with less caution, called up more reinforcements until 60 German soldiers were streaming toward the pass, bunching together in the natural choke point that the terrain created, moving into the funnel that Alexei had identified and that Soviet machine guns and mortars now covered from carefully prepared positions on the ridges above. The final flash was longer than the others, more deliberate, a sustained reflection that lasted 3 full seconds instead of the brief half-second glimpses he'd created earlier, and this flash served dual purposes. For the Germans it appeared to be a target that had stopped moving, had taken cover and was now stationary, suggesting that the pursuit had succeeded in cornering their quarry and that a final assault would achieve the kill, but for the Soviet forces watching from their concealed positions this sustained flash was the signal they'd been waiting for, the indication that the trap was set and the Germans were in position and the moment had come to spring the ambush. Alexei dropped behind cover, pressed himself flat against the frozen ground behind a fallen birch log that would provide minimal protection but was better than nothing, and raised a red cloth tied to a stick, waving it 3 times in the signal that Major Sokolov had specified meant commence fire, and for a moment the forest remained silent, retained that crystalline winter quiet that precedes violence, and then the world exploded into sound and fury as Soviet machine guns opened fire, simultaneously from both ridges. The Maxim guns fired with their distinctive rapid-fire chatter, heavy 7.62mm rounds tearing through the pass at enfilade angles that meant every bullet that missed one target had a high probability of hitting another, creating overlapping fields of fire that left no cover, no safe positions, no place where German soldiers could take shelter from the hail of metal that swept the length of the kill zone. The machine gunners had prepared for this moment, had stockpiled ammunition within easy reach, had calculated their firing lanes and identified aiming points, and now they executed their craft with the grim efficiency of men who'd been doing this for years, traversing their weapons back and forth across the pass, firing in controlled bursts that conserved ammunition while maintaining sustained fire, adjusting their aim as Germans tried to flee or find cover, ensuring that every square meter of the kill zone was covered by interlocking fire. The mortar teams added their contribution seconds later, shells arcing overhead and dropping behind the German force, cutting off retreat routes, creating a wall of explosive fragmentation that prevented anyone from running back the way they'd come, and the shells were timed and spaced to create a barrier rather than precision kills, to force the Germans forward into the machine gun fire or sideways into snow drifts that slowed movement and made them easier targets. The acoustics of the pass amplified every sound, made the gunfire seem to come from multiple directions, created echoes that bounced between the ridges and made it impossible to determine exactly where the Soviet positions were. And this acoustic confusion combined with the smoke and snow thrown up by explosions to create a sensory overload that made tactical response nearly impossible, that turned trained soldiers into confused individuals who could only react rather than organize, who realized too late that they'd walked into a perfectly prepared ambush. Alexei watched from his hiding place as the ambush unfolded exactly as he'd planned, watched German soldiers realizing their mistake, saw them trying to find cover in terrain that offered none, saw officers attempting to organize retreat but finding their escape routes blocked by mortars, saw the careful German advance dissolve into chaos as sustained machine gun fire made standing suicidal, and the only options were finding non-existent cover or attempting to flee through snow that was waste. deep and slowed movement to a crawl. Shards of ice blasted into the air from mortar impacts, creating glittering clouds that caught the low afternoon sun. Branches snapped under the weight of accumulated snow disturbed by shock waves. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed between the frozen ridges, creating a continuous roar that drowned out individual shots and screams, and Alexei breathed frost, his exhalations creating small clouds that dissipated quickly in the cold air. His body shaking from hypothermia and adrenaline and the visceral reality of watching a plan that existed first in his imagination and then on maps become transformed into the concrete reality of violence and death. Within minutes, though time became elastic and nobody could later agree whether the initial slaughter lasted 2 minutes or 10, the German spearhead was shattered, had ceased to exist as a coherent military force, had been transformed from 60 soldiers advancing with purpose into a scattered collection of casualties and survivors who'd abandoned their weapons and equipment and were trying desperately to escape the kill zone by any means available. The Soviet assault came from multiple directions simultaneously, with rifle squads that had been held in reserve charging forward while the machine guns maintained suppressive fire, while German survivors were still reeling from the ambush, while command and control had completely broken down and individual German soldiers were making survival decisions rather than tactical ones, and this Soviet counterattack caught the Germans from unexpected angles, made them believe they were surrounded by forces larger than actually present because the echoing gunfire and the attacks from multiple directions created an impression of overwhelming numbers. German officers who'd been confident 20 minutes earlier now faced the catastrophic realization that their aggressive pursuit had been exactly what the Soviets wanted, that they'd been lured into terrain specifically chosen for maximum Soviet advantage, that the scout they'd been chasing had never existed except as reflected sunlight and their own trained responses to visual stimuli, and this realization combined with the immediate tactical disaster to create panic that spread through the German force faster than any order could travel. German reinforcements that had been moving up to exploit what they thought was a breakthrough opportunity suddenly stopped, hesitated, tried to understand what was happening ahead of them where sustained gunfire and explosions suggested major combat rather than the pursuit of a fleeing scout, and this hesitation gave Soviet forces time to consolidate their positions, to establish a defensive line that prevented further German advance, and most importantly to create a window for the Soviet battalion to disengage from its trapped position and fall back to more defensible terrain before the Germans could regroup and resume their encirclement attempt. Alexei crawled toward Soviet lines, moving slowly because his body was hypothermic and his muscles weren't responding properly, because frostbite had numbed his hands and feet, because exhaustion from hours of physical and mental stress had left him operating on pure will rather than energy, and when he finally reached friendly positions he collapsed, was dragged into a foxhole by soldiers who barely recognized him because he was coated in frozen mud and ice, was wrapped in every spare blanket the squad could find while someone forced hot tea down his throat, and he lay there shaking uncontrollably while sounds of continued fighting echoed through the forest and someone reported that the Germans were retreating, were pulling back from their encirclement attempt, were apparently consolidating defensive positions rather than continuing their attack. Major Sokolov found Alexei 2 hours later, found him sitting by a small fire still wrapped in blankets, his rifle across his knees and in his hand the mirror shard that had started everything, the fractured surface reflecting firelight in broken patterns, and the major sat down beside him and said nothing for a long time because what was there to say about a plan that had seemed insane but had worked perfectly, that had saved the battalion from certain destruction, that had turned 60 German soldiers into casualties and broken the momentum of their entire attack using nothing more expensive than mirrors and understanding of human psychology. "You saved us," Sokolov finally said, his voice rough from cold and smoke and shouting orders. "You saved the entire battalion, and I'm recommending you for the Order of the Red Star, though I'm not sure how to explain in the paperwork that you did it with a broken mirror." And Alexei just nodded slightly, too exhausted to speak, too cold to feel anything except a distant satisfaction that his strange idea had worked. The soldiers gathered around fires that night, fires that were allowed because the Germans had pulled back far enough that light discipline was temporarily relaxed, and they recounted the battle, embellishing it slightly in the way soldiers always do but keeping close to the truth because the truth was remarkable enough without exaggeration. They'd been minutes from annihilation or surrender, had been trapped with no good options, and then a young scout had proposed something that sounded like a fairy tale but had worked, had lured 60 Germans into a perfectly prepared kill zone using sunlight and mirrors and the exploitation of training that had taught German soldiers to trust their eyes, and the ambush had been so perfectly executed that Soviet casualties were minimal while German losses were catastrophic, and most importantly the German attack had stalled, had lost its momentum, had given the Soviet regiment time to stabilize the line and prevent a breakthrough that could have led to encirclement and destruction. Alexei sat slightly apart from the main group, warming his hands over flames that did little to penetrate the deep cold that had settled into his core, studying the mirror shard that he still carried, watching snowflakes land on the fractured surface and melt slowly, and he thought about how war transformed ordinary objects into weapons, how physics and psychology could be as deadly as bullets when applied with understanding and precision, how desperation sometimes produced innovations that would never emerge from comfortable planning rooms, and how the smallest advantages, a flash of light, a moment of deception, an enemy's trained response, could tip the balance of battles and save lives that would otherwise have been lost. The narrative of what happened on January 23, 1943, spread through Soviet forces, carried by soldiers who'd witnessed the ambush or heard detailed accounts from participants, embellished slightly with each retelling but maintaining the essential truth. A reconnaissance scout named Alexei Voronov had saved his battalion by using a broken mirror to create an illusion of a fleeing soldier that lured German forces into a trap. The technique was simple enough that other units could adapt it, required no special equipment beyond reflective surfaces and sunlight and understanding of enemy psychology, and represented exactly the kind of innovative tactical thinking that kept Soviet forces competitive despite often being outgunned and outmaneuvered by German tactical doctrine. Intelligence officers interviewed Alexei, made him explain the technique in detail, documented it in reports that filtered up through command structures, and while it never became official doctrine because it was too dependent on specific terrain and weather conditions and enemy behavior to be reliably repeatable, it entered the informal knowledge base that experienced soldiers shared, became one of those tricks that scouts learned from other scouts that got passed down through combat. Experience rather than formal training, that represented the accumulated wisdom of men who survived not by following manuals but by adapting them to reality. Alexei Voronov survived the war, fought through the liberation of Belorussia and Ukraine and Poland and finally into Germany itself, accumulated medals and promotions and wounds both physical and psychological that were common to everyone who spent years in frontline combat, and after the war ended he returned to his home village in the Urals, worked in a mine, married, raised children, and rarely spoke about his military service except in the most general terms, following the pattern of combat veterans worldwide who found that people who hadn't experienced war couldn't really understand it no matter how detailed the explanation, and that sometimes silence was easier than trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap. But he kept the mirror shard, kept it in a small wooden box with his medals and military documents, and sometimes on winter mornings when sunlight came through his window at certain angles, he would take out the mirror and hold it so light reflected off the fractured surface, creating small bright spots on the wall that danced as his hand moved slightly. And he would remember that January day in 1943 when he'd knelt in the snow holding this same piece of glass and had realized that light could be weaponized, that perception could be manipulated, that wars were won not just by courage and firepower but by understanding how enemies thought and what they'd been trained to do and how those trained responses could be turned against them. The mirror trick shouldn't have worked by any conventional military analysis. It was too simple, too dependent on enemy cooperation, too vulnerable to 1,000 things going wrong. But it had worked because war amplifies small advantages, because desperate situations require unconventional solutions, because sometimes the difference between annihilation and survival is a flash of light mistaken for movement, a false signal interpreted as opportunity, a single scout thinking like a hunter setting traps instead of prey running from predators, and in a war of tanks and artillery and mechanized armies that killed millions through industrial-scale violence, one of the most decisive moments for 500 Soviet soldiers came from a glint of sunlight off a broken mirror held by a man who understood that the most powerful weapons aren't always the ones that kill enemies but sometimes the ones that make enemies kill themselves by walking into carefully prepared traps while believing they're pursuing opportunities. The Red Army would go on to develop increasingly sophisticated deception operations, would create entire Maskirovka doctrine around misleading enemy intelligence, would use dummies and decoys and false radio traffic and elaborate ruses to achieve strategic surprise at massive scale during operations like Bag Ration. But the fundamental principle that Alexei discovered in that frozen forest remained constant. Enemies can be manipulated if you understand their perceptions and training. Small asymmetric advantages can produce disproportionate effects. Creativity and improvisation are force multipliers that cost nothing but thought, And sometimes a soldier armed with understanding of physics and psychology can achieve what entire divisions cannot achieve through firepower alone. And that truth, demonstrated so dramatically in the forests near Smolensk in January 1943, became part of the accumulated wisdom that helped the Soviet Union survive its darkest period and eventually prevail in the most destructive war in human history, proving that in warfare as in life, survival often depends less on resources than on the intelligence to use what you have in ways nobody expected, the courage to try solutions that seem absurd until they work, and the recognition that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one your enemy never sees coming because it exists in their own mind, in their training and doctrine and assumptions about how war works, and all you had to do was provide the trigger, a flash of light, a moment of deception, a perfectly executed trap, and let their own responses do the rest.